Obviously, one of the big things was the Ten Commandments, and I gave you like one word summary of the Ten Commandments. And among the other things I covered was a little bit about slavery, because I thought that was a little bit puzzling. How do we come to terms with the fact that a loving and just God would have permitted slavery under the Old Covenant? And then we talked about various rules relating to personal injuries, property rights, just various laws, like how to treat strangers and orphans and so on. And here and there we read about the Sabbath and how important that is. I also made a comparison between Jesus and Moses, that there are many parallels. And one of the things that I said was that both of them were children of virgin mothers. And I want to make something clear. I was not saying that Moses was the result of a virgin birth. In his case, he was adopted by a woman whom we don't know a lot about, but probably was childless, and that was his mother. So that's what I meant. Not that he was born of a virgin, but that he was adopted by a virgin. We know that his actual parents were Amram and Jochebed. Also, another point that I wanted to bring out that I forgot was this idea that as important as not only the Ten Commandments, but just the old law in general was, and still is really, that we are not under that today. It makes it very clear in the New Testament by various New Testament writers that we are not under the old law, that was nailed to the cross, so to speak. And I remember when I was a new Christian, I heard this, I was a little bit puzzled. But let me give you an analogy. If I were to commit a crime here in the United States, I would be punished under United States law. Now, if I were traveling to Canada and spent a few weeks there and I ended up committing a crime in Canada, maybe the same crime there is against the law, I would be convicted under Canadian law. So even though murder is illegal here, it's illegal there, stealing is illegal here, it's illegal there, it's still legal under both laws, both systems, but the authority is different. And that's kind of how it is with the Old Testament and the New Testament. Things that were wrong under the Old Testament are still wrong under the New Testament. And things that were right under the Old Testament are still right under the New Testament. So if I commit murder, that's still a sin, but it's not because I've broken the Ten Commandments. I've never broken the Ten Commandments because I'm not subject to the Ten Commandments. But it does violate the law of Christ. And so that's something I think that we need to understand. And there are things that God was displeased with under the Old Covenant that maybe there's not a specific significant, or I would say a specific teaching about it perhaps in the New Testament, but that doesn't mean that God's okay with it now. There are some things that are still sinful, and so that's why we can learn a lot from the Old Covenant. So I want to make that clear as well. So that was a recap of last week. Now we're going to finish up chapter 23. I didn't quite get through there, but there are 3 national feasts that are mentioned here. That it says that 3 times a year the Israelites were to celebrate a feast to God in which all the males would appear before the Lord. And one of them was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It was begun at the same time as the Passover, but it lasted 7 days. And when you read about the Passion of Jesus, you read them where it talks about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Then there's another one called the Feast of the Harvest. It's also called the Feast of the Weeks, the Day of the First Fruits. We probably know it better as Pentecost, such as Acts chapter 2. It occurred 50 days after the Passover, and they began to number the 50 days on the morning after the first Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or on the 16th day of Abib or Nisan, which I think are the same month. And, of course, that was significant in Acts chapter 2. The third national feast in which all the males were to appear was the Feast of the Ingathering also known as the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. This one begins on the 15th day of Tishri, and it lasts 7 days. The people dwelt in booths formed of the branches of trees in commemoration of their temporary habitations during the journey through the wilderness. It's kind of like, if you were migrating and your ancestors were dwelling in tents or covered wagons, maybe everybody would sleep out in a covered wagon to try to maybe remember how their ancestors lived. And it was inaugurated by a holy convocation, and when it occurs in the sabbatical year, portions of the law are read publicly each day. And some of this I'm pulling from other scriptures outside of Exodus. What I don't have here, I don't remember exactly what time of year the Feast of the Ingathering is, but my hunch is it's in the fall, but I'm not positive about that. Continuing on, chapter 23, God is instructing them and preparing them for the eventual conquest of the land. And he's giving some warnings. He says, and some instructions. He says, God will send an angel to lead them to the promised land. They are to drive out the inhabitants of the land. You shall not worship their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their deeds, but you shall utterly overthrow them and break their memorial stones in pieces. And we know eventually that they were only partially successful. They did not really follow through. And because of that, God knew what he was saying. Because of that, that was a continual snare for centuries and centuries to come. It eventually led to the eventual breaking of the kingdom into two parts. Furthermore, God said, you shall make no covenant with them or with their gods. They shall not live in your land. Otherwise, they will make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it is certain to be a snare to you. And of course, we know many times it was. God also says that he will drive the inhabitants out gradually, not all at once, so the place doesn't become overgrown or filled with wild animals. So he'll make it step by step. And then he talks about the size of their new nation. God promises to set Israel's boundary from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, which I think he means the Mediterranean Sea, and from the wilderness, which would probably be like the Sinai Peninsula area and south of that, and also all the way to the Euphrates River. That gets us now to chapter 24, where the people affirmed their covenant with God. Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and he wrote down all the words of the Lord. Then he built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 memorial stones for the 12 tribes of Israel. And then they offered sacrifices. It says, Moses took the book of the covenant and read it as the people listened, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. The phrase famous last words come to my mind here, because we're going to see in not too long that they quickly forget all that God did for them, but that's coming up shortly. In verse 8, so Moses took the blood from the sacrifices and sprinkled it on the people to seal the covenant. Then Moses went part way up with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, which are the two older sons of Aaron, and 70 of the elders of Israel, where they saw manifestation of God. Verse 12, the Lord told Moses to come up on the mountain where he would receive the stone tablets with the law and the commandments which God had written for their instruction. So Moses got up along with Joshua his servant, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. So we know that he went up there with Joshua. I'm not sure how far Joshua went with him, though. Verse 14, but the elders were told to remain behind, and then Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights, which should remind you a little bit of Jesus in the wilderness 40 days and 40 nights. Now we're moving on to chapter 25, but just in kind of in a summary here, chapters 25 through 30 mention the design, let's say, the design and the materials of the various articles that go into the tabernacle. Chapter 25 has the very first mention of a sanctuary and begins by listing the offerings that the people should bring for its construction. In chapters 25, 26, and 27, you have the instructions for the building and the items in it. You have the Ark of the Covenant, the table for the bread of the presence, the golden lampstand, curtains of linen, curtains of goat's hair, boards and bases, the veil and the curtain, the bronze altar, and the courtyard of the tabernacle. The whole tabernacle itself was meant to be a portable worship center that they could pick up and go anywhere and then set it up wherever they come and stop. Chapter 28 and 29 address the priests who were to serve in the tabernacle. Chapter 28 gives instructions regarding the garments worn by the priests. Chapter 29 gives instructions regarding the consecration of the priests, the sacrifices they are to offer, and the food they were to eat. Chapter 30 then completes the remaining instructions for the tabernacle, which includes the altar of incense, the anointing oil, and the incense itself. Then in now we're going specifically in 25 here. That's just an overview of what I gave you. The first 9 verses just talk about the offerings for the sanctuary, trying to encourage people to bring their offerings. And then verses 10 through 22 actually address the ark itself, the gold-covered ark with the poles and the cherubim on top of the mercy seat. Verses 23 through 30 describe the materials and the dimension of the table of the showbread. Verses 31 through 40 describe the construction of the golden lampstand with its 7 candles. One of the things that I think we can really pull out of this, though, is that over and over again, God is making reference to the pattern, that God is showing Moses a pattern to follow, and it's really important. There's a lot of detail. It's very important that Moses follow that pattern. In 25:9, God says, according to all that I'm going to show you as the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furniture, so you shall construct it. Verse 40, see that you make them by the pattern for them, which was shown to you on the mountain. In 26:30, then you shall erect the tabernacle according to its plan, which you have been shown on the mountain. When God repeats something, that's probably because it's really important, that he wants to impress on Moses that God, for his own reasons, has a certain way he wants this thing to be built, as far as the materials that are allowed, the dimensions. He didn't want room for too much creativity and improvisation here to go their own way. And I think there's a lesson for us in the church today. God has a pattern for the church today. He has a pattern for, first of all, the terms of entrance into the church. There's a pattern for how we worship and the items of our worship and the content of our worship and what it is that we hear when we worship and the things that we do and when we worship and so on. So I think that, again, this is a principle that goes throughout the Bible, that God has a certain way that he wants things to be done. In chapter 26, we continue reading about various materials for the tabernacle. And again, it's very technical. We probably don't need to get into it too much. But the first part of it talks about the curtains of linen. And then it goes on and talks about the curtains of goat's hair, which I can understand wool, but I'm not quite sure how you weave something out of goat's hair. But obviously it can be done. And then from there, he talks about the various boards and the sockets, the veil and the screen. Moving on to chapter 27, he talks about things that are meant to be outside the tabernacle itself, or outside the holy place. There is the bronze altar, which is described in the first 8 verses. There's also the court of the tabernacle in 9 through 21, which is kind of like a screen to shield what's going on the inside. And normally the priests would work on the inside. Chapter 28 moves in a little bit different direction. Instead of getting away from the objects, it actually moves to the priests themselves. Aaron and the office of the high priest are a type of Christ. And that may be something perhaps next Sunday I might be able to deal with, but there are some parallels. Because Jesus is considered our high priest. If you look in the book of Hebrews, he's called a priest after the order of Melchizedek. It's a different order. But in many ways, he functions as our priest, offering up a sacrifice. In this case, it was his very own blood, his own life. We read in verses 3 and 4 that skillful people whom the Lord had endowed with the spirit of wisdom were to make holy garments for Aaron and his sons, so that they may serve as priests to God. And these are the garments which they shall make: a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a tunic of checkered work, a turban, and a sash. And you're seeing here some kind of reproduction of what we think generally the Old Testament priests look like. And in several ways, the high priest does foreshadow the ministry of Christ, who is our great high priest. And I give you many references in the book of Hebrews, like Hebrews 4, 9, in particular, those 2 chapters talk about Jesus as our high priest. Continuing on, talking about the priests, chapter 29 talks about the consecration of the priests and how this was to be done. 10 through 30 talks about the various sacrifices, and we'll read about that later. And later on this summer, we're going to be covering Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we'll really get deep into the different sacrifices, but there's so many. There's like burnt offerings, peace offerings, guilt offerings, wave offerings. I probably left some out, but I know there's quite a few different offerings for different things. So there's different sacrifices. And then verses 31 through 46 are the food for the priests. Like they get to eat some of the offerings in some cases. Chapter 30 returns back to some of the items of the tabernacle itself, beginning with the altar of incense in the first 21 verses. And incense, in many ways, is figurative or maybe a type of the prayers of the saints. When you go to the book of Revelation, you read about incense being offered up to God and talks about it as being like the prayers of the saints, a fragrant aroma. Verses 22 through 33 talk about the anointing oil. There's a special recipe to be followed for the special oil that was used to consecrate the priests. And then 34 through 38 talks about the incense, and likewise there's a particular formula that's supposed to be used in creating the incense. And the tabernacle is also a type of the church. In its materials, its colors, its furniture, its arrangement, the tabernacle clearly speaks of the person of Christ and the way of redemption, according to Burton Kaufman's commentary. The development is progressive from suffering, blood, and death to beauty, holiness, and the glory of God. The tabernacle, he says, is theology in physical form. So maybe next week, when we wrap things up, I may be able to go a little more detail of what I mean in the ways that Aaron parallels Christ and also the way that the tabernacle foreshadows the church. In chapter 31, we read about the craftsman. In order for all these wonderful materials to be designed and built, it takes skilled craftsmen, it takes artisans, people with creative abilities to do so. And that's what's addressed in chapter 31. And the two leading craftsmen or artisans that are mentioned here are Bezalel and Oholiab. Beginning with Bezalel, he was of the tribe of Judah. He was the son of Uri, and he was the grandson of Hur. And you may recall that Hur and Aaron were the two men that were lifting up Moses' hands during the battle with Amalek, so that as long as Moses' arms were up, the Israelites would prevail. And so he comes from a distinguished family. Bezalel is mentioned 7 times in the book of Exodus, as well as 1 time each in 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles. Bezalel had skill with metal, stone, and wood. He was filled with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, and in all kinds of craftsmanship to create artistic designs for work in gold, in silver, and bronze, and in the cutting of stones for settings, and in the carving of wood, so that he may work in all kinds of craftsmanship. And that's mentioned in 3 through 5. Now, I mentioned that he's working in bronze, and bronze is mentioned a lot in the Old Testament. And we all know it's a metal, but I'm not sure if you know much about bronze. So I was just kind of curious, and I looked up, well, what is bronze? Maybe you've heard of like the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. So I did a little research, and I found out that bronze is an alloy, consists mostly of copper, maybe 80 or 90% copper, and then a lesser amount of tin, sometimes with the addition of other metals to give it desirable properties as far as durability or strength or something like that. It's harder than copper alone and does have other useful properties. And in ancient times, bronze was the hardest metal in widespread use, so it was a popular metal. And Bezalel is specifically credited with making the Ark of the Covenant as well as the bronze altar, but surely he made other items and oversaw the work. So he was probably the foreman or maybe the lead craftsman that oversaw. They may have had dozens or maybe even hundreds of people working on different projects during the day. Some people doing the woodworking, some people working on the cloth, and so on. The other individual that's mentioned here, not as much as spoken of him, but his name is Oholiab. Oh, by the way, maybe I should back up. Bezalel means overshadowed by God. And that comes into play later because I'm going to say a little bit more about Bezalel in a moment. Oholiab is from the tribe of Dan. He was the son of Ahisamach. Couldn't find too much about anything else about Ahisamach or Oholiab, really. God says that in him and in the hearts of all who are skillful, I have put skill so that they may make everything that I have commanded you. And he's mentioned 5 times in Exodus. Oholiab is described as an engraver and a skilled embroiderer and a weaver in violet, in purple, and in scarlet material and fine linen. So I kind of get the impression that Bezalel specialized more maybe the metal and the wood, whereas Oholiab seemed like his specialties were more in various types of cloth and engraving things. So anyway, that seems to be it. Now, in the process of doing a little research on Bezalel, I just happened to come across 2 books that were written about Bezalel. And I think it's interesting. It's too small for me to read from here. I hope you can read it. But that's a description of one of the books. It's called The Bezalel Principle. Someone wrote in a book about this individual. And there's really not a lot about in the Bible. But I think the point of the book is, if you think about it, in the Bible, who gets most of the airtime or who gets most of the attention is typically the prophets, the priests, and the kings are typically the ones we read about. But there's a lot of minor characters that don't get a lot of recognition. And I think it's really important that, I think it's really neat that we should give some special recognition of the role these people play, because not everybody has those gifts, but they have other gifts to bring to God. And what Bezalel, I think what this is saying is that even though Bezalel may be considered a minor character, a lot of people don't even know his name, but what he did was really important. And he was obviously a leader. He supervised the other people, but he was the one who constructed the tabernacle. And God makes use of people with various talents. And it may be, you may not be a teacher, you may not be a preacher, you may not really be that good at maybe one-on-one Bible studies, but there's other skills that you can have that you can bless people and you can have a lasting impact. It may be like something as simple as quilting, like quilting for cancer patients, or maybe cooking a meal for somebody, or maybe it's for doing painting or helping babysit somebody. I mean, there's just so many other things that we can do that they kind of get below the radar, but in God's eyes, I think they're just as important. It's just that you're making use of your skill for the glory of God. And I think that's what this author's getting at with this book. And likewise, there's another book about Bezalel that, again, is kind of along the same lines. This one is focused more on people who are creative in nature. And sometimes people who are creative, he says, they get overlooked. They have various talents. Like one thing I'm impressed, like you go out in the hallway over here and you see these beautiful paintings of nature, and you see all the design here in the foyer, the reconstruction. And I mean, I'm just amazed with the creative mind of people that they can think up these things and they have this kind of skill. Because when I draw, they kind of look like caveman drawings and stick figures. That's just not my gift. But I'm really, I really admire people that have that kind of gift. So anyway, who knows? Maybe these are on my to-do list. Someday when I have time to read, I'd like to read those. Well, in that same chapter, we read about how important it is to observe the Sabbath. The Israelites are required to keep the Lord's Sabbaths throughout their generations as a sign between them and God, so that they may know that God is the Lord who sanctifies them. And those who profane it were to be put to death. And this is mentioned more than once. So here and there, sprinkled throughout Exodus, we see continual reminders that the Sabbath is important. It's a covenant. I mean, what other nation can you think of that's famous for observing the Sabbath day as holy? It's the Jewish people. God reminds them that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the seventh day he ceased from labor and was refreshed. So here's a reminder. Just a year ago I taught Genesis, and we spent a little time talking about the 6 days of creation. Well, here's another reiteration that God is not saying, well, he's not like saying, well, that was just figurative or whatever. I mean, he's just reiterating that I really did make the earth in 6 literal days, and all of creation, the whole universe. And then it says, when God had finished speaking with Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave Moses the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written by the finger of God. So Moses did not chisel them himself. It said it was written by the finger of God. And later on, it mentions that the tablets were written on both sides. So like when I print out a piece of paper, I have the option of printing one side or both sides. And God opted for both sides on the tablets. Well, now we're getting into one of those very sad milestones, unfortunate cases, the golden calf. Probably of all the incidents in Exodus, you have certain things stand out. The 10 plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea, the 10 commandments, and then there's the incident with the golden calf. And boy, people have a short memory, don't they? So here we are in chapter 32. The first 10 verses read about the making of the golden calf. Well, Moses was up there, and Joshua were up there for 40 days and 40 nights. The people got impatient waiting for Moses. And they said something like, well, we don't know what happened to this Moses. And they told Aaron to make a god for them. And of course, Aaron, being the high priest of the God of Israel, and being the brother of Moses, said, "No way would I do that." Or, wait a minute. No, he didn't say it, did he? No, I'm afraid not. This was probably not the best moment in Aaron's life. But that did not disqualify him from being high priest later. So I feel like there's hope for us, that sometimes maybe we can mess up really bad. Sometimes we can really exercise poor judgment. We can be led astray, but we can always be brought back, that God will find mercy for us. And that's one of the takeaways I get from this. So they asked Aaron to make them a god, and it doesn't seem like Aaron was particularly reluctant. Now, maybe he felt a little peer pressure. Maybe there's one of him, and there's like thousands and thousands of them, and they're surrounding him and say, "Hey, we want you to make us a god." And he probably just kind of gave in. Anyway, so he told them to donate gold jewelry from which he had fashioned a cast metal calf. The people credited the idol with delivering them from Egypt. Now, think about it. They had seen the 10 plagues. They had seen the pillar of smoke and the pillar of fire. They crossed the Red Sea. They had been delivered the manna and the quails, water coming from the rock. They had seen all these things, the one true God. And then after all that, they actually created this thing out of gold. I mean, think about it. They're looking at that calf. Part of that calf used to be my earring or my nose ring, and now it's on the calf. It's like it went from my ear to the calf, but I didn't worship it when it was on my earlobe, but now I'm going to worship it now that it's in the shape of a calf. And that calf, it doesn't breathe, it doesn't talk, it doesn't smell, it doesn't see. And yet they're giving that calf the credit. And they got all wild, they got out of hand. And so Aaron built this altar in front of the calf itself so they could worship, and they declared a feast. The people began worshiping the calf. They sacrificed various offerings to the calf. And, of course, God knew this was all going on. And so he tells Moses, he says, "Go down the mountain." He said the people, they've gone astray, and God, he was ready to destroy them. He had already had enough. He had given them a lot of chances, and they just kept being ungrateful. In verses 11 through 18, we see Moses' entreaty. This is one of the ways where Moses is like Jesus in that he's interceding on behalf of his people. So Moses intercedes on behalf of the rebellious Israelites. In contrast to verse 7, well, let me back up. Verse 7 here, God says to Moses, "Your people whom you led out of Egypt." And it kind of reminds me, like when you have parents, and sometimes when a child behaves, one parent will say, "Do you know what your son did today?" Or, "Do you know what your daughter did today?" It's kind of like when they're bad, they're your child, but when they're good, they're my child. And I kind of feel like this is almost like what's going on, because in a way, they are God's people, and God did lead them out of Egypt. But in another way, they are also Moses' people, and Moses led them out. I mean, they're both true, but in different aspects. But God says, they're your people, you led them out, and now look at them. And then Moses kind of turned that back around, and he's reminding them, they're your people. You led them out with your strength. And he gives three reasons here why God should not destroy his people. So again, in contrast to verse 7, Moses reminds the Lord that the Israelites are God's people and that he brought them out of Egypt. Number 2, he essentially says, don't give the Egyptians any grounds for criticizing actions. If the Egyptians hear that you took them out of the wilderness and you destroyed them, then it's just going to be so negative. They're going to say, "Oh, that God, he was so bad. He just took them out just so he could destroy them." Don't give the Egyptians any ammunition here to say anything bad about you. And then number 3, he reminds God of the promise he made to their forefathers, the promises he made to Abraham and to Isaac and Jacob, to greatly multiply their descendants and to give them the land of Canaan as an inheritance. So, God, if you do this, then, how will that fit with the promise you made? You promised to give their descendants a place. And so, because Moses interceded, the Lord relented of the harm from which he said he would do to his people. Now, this does also show a principle. You can see various times in the Old Testament where God says, I'm going to do this. I'm going to punish this, or I'm going to do that. But then, maybe because somebody intercedes, or somebody pleads, or somebody repents, God changes his mind. So it does show that through prayer and through our own behavior, that we can alter God's decisions, or we can alter the outcome of things. So that God is not locked in, that what we do can make a difference with God. And then moving on, in beginning of verse 19, we read about Moses' anger. In addition to idol worship, the Israelites had been dancing, they had been engaging in lewd behavior, and were out of control to the point of being an object of ridicule to their enemies. So apparently, whatever they was doing, there must have been other people in the area that were probably spying on them, observing them, seeing what the Israelites were going to do next, and noticed that, wow, these people are just going crazy out here in the desert. They're just like out of control, like a ship without a rudder. And so Moses and Joshua went down the mountain, and Moses was so angry, he had a bit of a temper tantrum, and he threw the tablets down, shattering them to pieces, verse 19. And then, to really drive it home with the people how bad it was, he ground the calf to powder, mixed it with water, he made everybody drink the gold, I don't know how that was, the gold water. So anyway, I guess they got their mineral supplement that day. But he ground it to powder, made them drink, and then he recruited the Levites to mete out punishment with the sword, and the Levites killed 3,000 people that day in punishment. I would assume they probably went after the worst of the offenders, the leaders of the rebellion, because I know it sounds harsh, but imagine if they didn't do that, by the people going astray, they would ultimately lose their souls, which is even more serious. And it was pointed out in a few lessons a few Sundays ago that there was a time under the Old Covenant where 3,000 people died when the law was delivered. But in the New Testament, Acts chapter 7, we read that 3,000 people were saved when the New Covenant came out. And if that wasn't enough, the Lord struck them with a plague in verse 35, just to show how unpleased he was, if that's a word, unpleased. Moses urged the people to rededicate themselves to the Lord, and then he turned to God and interceded once more on their behalf. And then in chapter 33, we have the journey resumed. So this was a very sad blight on the Israelites. And I think, sometimes if you've ever done something really bad and it's been brought to your attention, you come to your senses and you realize, you probably think, how could I have done that? Why did I do that? And you probably feel ashamed. And I get the impression in chapter 33, that's how the people felt. They felt really bad. They knew that God was really upset with them, that he wanted to withdraw his presence from them. God instructed Moses to resume the journey, and the Lord said he will send an angel to lead them, and the Lord will drive out the inhabitants of the land, but he refuses to go in their midst. It's like I can't stand to be around you. It's like there's sometimes when somebody's really angry with you, they don't even want to look at you, they don't want to be around you. And I think that's kind of how God was here. He had really had enough. He had been rejected so many times. And this, of course, this saddens the people, and they removed the jewelry from this point on. From that point on, they didn't wear jewelry, it says. This is a bad experience, and they kind of held their heads low. Moses pitched his tent, like here, pitched his tent outside the camp. So he moved outside the camp, and he called this the tent of meeting, where people could come and talk to him. It says the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. Verse 9. And Moses asks God, in the next, beginning of verse 12, Moses intercedes. Moses asks God to show him his ways and for God's presence to be with them during their journey. And God agrees. God agrees. 18 through 23, Moses then asks God to show him his glory. God agrees to grant the request, saying, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. Verse 19. He further said, You cannot see my face, for mankind shall not see me and live. Verse 20. The Lord says he will place Moses in the cleft of a rock and cover him with his hand while God's glory passes by. And then as God passes by, he said he will remove his hand, and then God will see him from the back, but he will not see him from the front. So we don't know exactly what Moses saw, but he saw some kind of manifestation of God. And it's interesting that we have a number of songs that are inspired by events in Exodus. One of them is called He Hideth My Soul. And I'm going to read you verse 1 in the refrain. A wonderful Savior is Jesus my Lord, a wonderful Savior to me. He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock, where rivers of pleasure I see. And then the refrain goes like this. He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock, that shadows a dry, thirsty land. He hideth my life in the depths of his love, and covers me there with his hand. And covers me there with his hand. So it's taken right out of chapter 33 here. And then we have another hymn called Rock of Ages. And it may have reference to perhaps this, but also maybe the water rock. But it says, Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. So that summarizes chapter 33, and I finished just about where I wanted to be. Next Sunday, when we come back, we've got chapter 34 through the remainder of the book. There's 40 chapters. So Moses, he broke the tablets. He's going to go up there another time and get a replacement set of tablets, bring them down, and then we'll read where the tabernacle, we read about the instructions for the tabernacle, then we're going to read about the actual construction of it, and then it's finally set up and ready to go just in time for Leviticus. So thank you for your kind attention. So glad you could come this morning. And thank you to our audience at home. A special send out to my wife, Ting, who is sick this morning. Good morning. I love you. Bye.